Welcome to the session on Towards a Feminist Poetics by Elaine Showalter. Elaine Showalter is an American critic, feminist, and writer on cultural and social issues. She is one of the founders of feminist literary criticism in the United States academia, and she developed the concept and practice of gynocriticism. Showalter is a specialist in Victorian literature, and her most innovative work in this field is in madness and hysteria in literature, especially in women's writing and the portrayal of female characters. Her best known works include A Literature of Their Own, British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing, which was initially her doctoral thesis developed into a book. Her next book, The Female Malady, Women, Madness and English Culture, was a historical examination of women and the practice of psychiatry. She also wrote Sexual Anarchy, Gender and Culture at the Findley Sequel, Sister's Choice, Tradition and Change in American Women's Writing, Histories, Historical Epidemics and Modern Culture, a controversial exploration of history of mass hysteria. She has also written Teaching Literature, which is an analysis of the academic novel and its relation to real-world institutes of higher education. A Jury of Her Peers is a survey of women's writing in the United States from 1990s. The Civil War of Julia Ward Howe is a biography about the American author. She has also edited several volumes including The New Feminist Criticism and Daughters of Decadence, Women Writers of the Findley Sequel. Towards a Feminist Poetics mainly talks about feminist criticism in its two phases. She calls the first phase as feminist critique, wherein woman is the reader, and the second phase as gynocriticism, wherein woman becomes the writer. Showalter seems to be concerned about the stereotypes of feminism that see feminist critics as being obsessed with the destroying male artists. And she wonders if these stereotypes emerge from the fact that feminism lacks a fully articulated theory. And in this particular work, as we said before, she divides feminist criticism into two sections. The first section is the woman as a reader, or the feminist critique. Here, we look at the way in which a female reader changes our understanding of a given text, giving importance to the sexual chords that are there in a given text. And according to her, according to Showalter, this is a historical grounded inquiry which looks into the ideological assumptions of literary phenomena. And the major concerns of this feminist critique are the images and stereotypes of women in literature, the omissions and misconceptions about women in criticism, and the fissures in male-constructed literary history. There is also a concern with the exploitation and manipulation of the female audience, especially in popular culture and film, and with the analysis of women as sign in semiotic systems. We'll talk about that a little later. So, to understand this better, let's take the novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, written by Samuel Richardson. Now, this novel was written in the 1740s And Samuel Richardson, being a man, tells a story of a 15-year-old maid servant named as Pamela Andrews. Now, here in this work, we understand the woman Pamela from the perspective of the male writer Samuel Richardson. And as the subtitle suggests, she is presented as a virtuous woman whose virtue is rewarded with the final culmination of her marriage. So here, when a female reader reads this text, Pamela, we look at the ways in which sexual chords are associated with this woman, Pamela. We also look at the images and stereotypes of Pamela, Pamela as a virtuous woman. We also look at how this male constructed story is erroneous in itself. So when we look at when we look at feminist criticism from the point of view of woman as a reader, we can see that it is political in nature. And there is a lot of Marxist influence when we look at feminist criticism, especially with regard to the hierarchies that we talk about. Now, woman as sign was a semiotic construct developed by the feminist scholars. And it was Laura Mulvey who started talking about woman as a sign. So she says that woman stands in patriarchal culture as a signifier for the male other within a symbolic system in which men are permitted to live out their fantasies of domination, both linguistically and through the images they create. So woman becomes a sign for the man. Woman becomes a signifier for the man, because without woman, man ceases to have the patriarchal power that he assumes. And it was Elizabeth Covey who coined the term woman as sign based on her work with Levi-Strauss on the kinship systems that featured the exchange of women, especially when a bride leaves her father's house to live in her husband's house. So women are seen as a commodity here, economic commodity here. A woman is exchanged for a dowry, and that she is seen as a means for economic prosperity. So that is exactly what we mean by woman as a sign. Woman is not seen for her individual self, but woman is seen for her economic value, and also for a symbolic system, for the existence of a symbolic system wherein man achieves some kind of power by their dominating nature. And Elaine Showalter says that the problems with feminist critique is that it is male-oriented in nature. Here, if we study the stereotypes of women, the sexism of male critics, and the limited roles women play in literary history, we are not learning what women have experienced and felt, but we only understand them through what men thought women should be. Going back to the example of Pamela, we have a man's version of a woman in the characterization of Pamela. So this critique has a tendency to naturalize women's victimization by making it inevitable and obsessive topic of discussion. So a feminist criticism always looks for the ways in which women are oppressed, the ways in which women are victimized, and we have a tendency to naturalize this victimization, blaming everything on the patriarchal system. And that is actually a limitation of feminist criticism. Now, it is at this point that Elaine Showalter feels the need to propose a new theory, which she calls gynocriticism. Now, in gynocriticism, we look at woman as the writer. Woman becomes the producer of textual meaning. We look at the history, the themes, the genres, the structures of literature by women here. And Elaine Showalter coined the term gynocritics to describe the literary criticism which is based in a female perspective. To quote her, she says, in contrast to an angry or loving fixation on male literature, the program of gynocritics is to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, to develop new models based on study of female experience rather than to adapt male models and theories. Gynocritics begin at a point when we free ourselves from the linear absolutes of male literary history, stop trying to fit women between the lines of male tradition, and focus instead on the newly visible world of female culture. Now, this does not mean that the goal of gynocritics is to erase the differences between male and female writing. Gynocritics instead aim at understanding the specificity of women's writings not as a product of sexism but as a fundamental aspect of female reality. So, as we said, its prime concern is to see woman as the producer of textual meaning. And the subjects include the psychodynamics of female creativity, the language, the problem associated with the female language, the trajectory of individual or collective female literary career, and it proposes to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature. Showalter acknowledges the difficulty of defining the unique differences of women's writing. And she says that gynocritics may never succeed in understanding the special differences of women's writing or realize a distinct female tradition, but with grounding in theory and historical research, Showalter sees gynocriticism as a way to learn something solid and real about the relation of women to literary culture. Now, going back to what we said before, one of the subjects of gynocriticism include the psychodynamics of female creativity. Psychodynamic feminism has its roots in the second and third waves of feminism in the United States. And it seeks to articulate the unique experiences of an individual while at the same time contextualizing those experiences within a socio-political, cultural, and economic framework. So, it addresses sexism, it addresses heterosexism, ableism, racism, classism, and other injustices based on power differentials. So that exactly is the difference between feminist criticism and gynocriticism. In feminist criticism, if we are looking at how male has constructed woman or female, how male has presented woman, female, or how male has stereotyped female. Instead of that, here we articulate the experiences of the individual. We articulate the uniqueness of a female experience. It need not necessarily be a story of victimization, but it is a female gaze where we look at the world from the eyes of a woman. In the poems and the stories that you're going to learn in this syllabus, we focus on this kind of an understanding. We focus on understanding the world from the woman's perspectives. Definitely, there are stories that deal with women's oppression and victimization, but the focus here is not simply on naturalizing women's victimization, but in understanding the female experience as a unique entity. And And as we said before, the program of gynocriticism is to construct a female framework. It attempts at developing new models based on the study of female experiences. Gynocriticism stops trying to fit women in the lines of male literary tradition. It focuses on the visible world of female culture. And another important thing is the attempt to recreate the chain of women writers in the female tradition. Elaine Showalter says that in understanding the history of women's writing, in tracing out the women's writing from the origins, we see a gradual evolution. We see a gradual connection between the women writers, which is important in understanding the woman's experiences over the period of time. So gynocriticism attempts at doing that. As she moves on from these experiences, she then begins a rough sketch of some of the elements that have characterized women's writings. That is awakening, suffering, unhappiness, and others. And she says that she talks about her classification of women's writing into 3 phases in order to establish the continuity of female tradition from decade to decade. Thus, she traces the history of women's literature, suggesting that can be divided into 3 phases. The first is feminine phase, starting from 1840 to 1880. Elaine Showalter sees the first phase taking place roughly between 1840 to 1880. And she calls this the feminine phase and declares that it is characterized by women writing in an effort to equal the intellectual achievements of the male culture. So the primary concern here was to be equal, was to imitate the male writing. And the distinguishing sign of this period is the male pseudonym. As we all know, the women writers in the early 1800s, they adopted a male name in order to exert a pressure on the narrative, in order to, exert a kind of recognition from the society. So this has affected the tone, diction, structure, and characterization from the perspective of a female. So the feminine phase can be understood basically as an imitation phase, where the woman was trying to imitate the man in terms of form, language, and structure. The second phase is what we call the feminist phase, and it starts from 1880 to 1920. Women were historically enabled to reject the accommodating postures of femininity and to use literature to dramatize the ordeals of the wronged womanhood. So this phase is characterized by visions of perfect female-led societies of the future. And it was characterized by women's writing that protested against the male standards and values and advocated women's rights and values, including a demand for autonomy. That's when women started fighting for their voting rights and their political rights. So feminist phase can be looked at as a phase where there were visions of this perfect female-led societies. And women also protested against the male standards and values, and they advocated women's rights. The third phase is what she calls the female phase. Now this is one of self-discovery. It started from 1920 and continues till date. Showalter says that during this stage, women reject both imitation and protest. And she calls imitation and protest as 2 forms of dependency. Because when we imitate the male author, we are dependent on the form and structure of the literary tradition of the male authors. Second one, when we protested them, we again wanted them or the male literary tradition was essential in order to protest, because if there is no opposition, who would you protest against? So she calls that also as a form of dependency. And the female stage, according to her, turns to the female experience as a source of autonomous art. And here she extends the feminist analysis of culture to the forms and techniques of literature. She does not offer a characteristic sign or figure for the female face, but suggests a diversity of experiences that is too broad to be encompassed in a single image. So, here she also talks about women like Virginia Woolf, who started thinking in terms of male sentences and female sentences. The female writing, or what you call the penneditha, became prominent during this period. Before she concludes, she says that approaching feminist criticism from a cultural perspective is, is significant. Feminists in the past have worked within the traditions by revising and criticizing female representations or the lack in the male traditions. And she moves on to talk about criticism as a science, or hermeneutics as a science, the study of interpretation as a science. So, just like any other sciences, here also we have two levels of understanding. One is what we call the higher criticism of literary science, which focuses mainly on the scientific forms of problem and structure. There is a lot of objectivity associated with this higher criticism. Think of any science. Let's take physics, for example. The theories become part of the higher criticism. They talk about the techniques, they are the scientific ways of addressing something. And the lower criticism is what we call the reality of it, the humanistic problems of content and interpretation. So, feminism becomes important from this lower perspective. That is exactly the reason why we can't associate feminism with Marxist criticism, because Marxist criticism seems to be scientific in nature. Here, the experiences of women can easily disappear, or they can become mute, invalid, and invisible. So, Elaine Showalter concludes the essay by saying that the task of feminist critics is to find a new language, a new way of reading that integrates the woman's intelligence and experience, reason and suffering, skepticism and vision. And on the whole, we may conclude that her views on feminist poetics are intelligent, and they are devoid of extremities, and they are provocative. She speaks with a conviction that feminist critiques, with the help of gynocriticism, will be able to achieve a new language and a new way of understanding the female experience. Thank you.